I had already filmed an intro for this video, but when I watched the intro back, I realized that it wasn't saying what I wanted it to. So I decided to start fresh and share the more genuine reason why I'm sharing this video you're about to watch. When this SciShow video that Hank Green produced about knitting and physics was first brought to my attention, I really didn't know what to think. I hadn't watched it yet, and when I did watch it, it didn't occur to me initially that there was anything wrong with it. I knew that Hank's audience isn't knitters. It's science folks, young adults, students, and I kept that in mind when I watched his video. But I had to wonder, what was it about this video that made so many knitters so frustrated? And the more I sat with it, the more I started to understand possibly what it was that was causing knitters to prickle. Not because the science was off, but possibly because there was a perception of a missed opportunity. Opportunities to highlight the humans behind the fabric, the beauty that is the craft of knitting outside of just the textile that it produces. The knitters whose ingenuity made the textiles possible long before physicists took notice. And I think that part of the reason why some of us reacted strongly is that knitters are quietly hoping for someone outside the knitting world, ideally with a big platform, to help adjust the perception of what knitting really is. So when we saw Hank was going to talk about knitting, many of us thought, hey, maybe this is the moment where someone will shine that light on the human ingenuity behind the craft. When it turned out not to be that, it felt deflating. Not because Hank failed. He was not responsible for carrying that weight. And his video did what it set out to do for his audience. But selfishly, maybe that's not the right word, knitters were hoping that this would be the one, and it wasn't. And that's okay. But it does help explain why people felt let down. That's what I want to reflect on here. Not to say that Hank's video needs changing, or that he did something wrong, or that he failed us as a knitting community, but to share possibly why at least some knitters heard it the way that they did. And I possibly want to explore why it matters that the human story of knitting doesn't get left out when knitting is talked about in a big way. And why so many of us, seeing knitting featured on a respected show and talked about by a respected speaker, I do respect Hank Green, I love what he puts out into the world, really hoped that those things would have been taken into consideration. So with all that in mind, here is the video that I've already filmed for your consideration. Hello, 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 and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Midweek Ramble. My name is Taylor, and I will be your host. Now, when most non-knitters in the United States think of knitting, the picture that comes to their mind is almost automatic. Someone sitting comfortably in a chair, working away on a baby blanket or an Afghan or some such thing. That's the image I grew up around, and it's the shorthand that still lingers in American media and culture today. And in other parts of the world, the general non-knitting perception is that knitting looks similar. It's cozy, it's familiar, it's rooted in tradition, and dare I say, a little old-fashioned, though with its own local flavor. However, while the details vary, the broad perception still remains the same. Knitting as a simple, home-centered pastime. And it's not entirely wrong. It's just not the whole picture. But it's that perception that I want to look at more closely. For centuries, knitting was considered domestic work, making socks, sweaters, mittens, and shawls for the family out of necessity. When machine production took over in the late 1800s and into the early 20th century, hand knitting shifted. It wasn't survival anymore. It became less about daily clothing needs and more of a choice. But then came the World Wars. In World War I, knitting became patriotic labor. The slogan, "Knit your bit," appeared on posters as civilians were encouraged to make socks, mittens, and balaclavas for soldiers at the front. Red Cross drives collected millions of garments, and public spaces hosted knitting circles dedicated entirely to the war effort. In World War II, rationing made store goods scarce. So knitting meant mending, reusing yarn, and stretching clothing further. Campaigns like Knitting for Victory encouraged people to knit service socks and vests and gloves to ship overseas. Soldiers' survival sometimes depended on hand-knit socks to ward off trench foot. So even after industrialization, knitting remained a necessity, but for reasons of war, morale, and scarcity, rather than everyday survival. By the 1950s, though, that urgency faded. Magazines, ads, and television began idealizing knitting as a part of a tidy, domestic scene, something a grandmother or a housewife did in a chair at the end of the day. And that's still a thing. But like I said earlier, it's just not the only thing. The shorthand was easy to recognize, and it stuck. Through the 1970s, the 80s, and even into the early 2000s, knitting continued quietly in homes everywhere. But to outsiders, that perception barely moved. The grandmother knitting for grandchildren picture carried forward unchanged. But something has shifted in the last 10 to 15 years, give or take a few years. Online communities, indie dyers, digital pattern economies, Instagram, Ravelry. Suddenly, the richness and variety of knitting became visible to anybody who cared to look.
I don't know where y'all at, but I'm almost done. We got one more decrease. It's the easiest decrease on this brioche board.
What's that?
I think this is the worst knitting mistake I've ever made, and as embarrassing as it is, I'm going to show it to you.
Y si lo hago con bolsillos, fue todo un desafío este pedido personalizado, pero se logró y Mariposa quedó sin ninguna costura.
The craft today is diverse, technically demanding, and deeply creative. That reality no longer fits neatly inside that cozy pastime snapshot we're all so familiar with. And here's a really important nuance. Knitters who want that perception to evolve aren't all creating intricate art pieces or experimental fabric designs. Many of us, myself included, are still knitting things that are simple and comfortable. But our awareness of the craft's breadth, of the ingenuity and creativity happening around us, makes us want that public perception to broaden too. We don't want the cozy image erased. We love the cozy image. It's what brings us back time and time again. We just want it joined by recognition of everything else that knitting has become. From the inside, knitting looks less like a hobby and more like a subculture. Designers pushing garment architecture, indie dyers building small economies, makers experimenting with sustainability, and knitters around the world connecting in ways that just weren't possible before. Knitting is always evolving, and as a craft is always capable of more. Which brings us back to Hank's and SciShow's video.
One of the oldest knit objects in the world is a sock.
With its wide reach to millions of viewers, it was a perfect opportunity to expand this perception, to acknowledge that knitting is both comfort and complexity, both tradition and innovation. And though it got to the innovation portion eventually, it leaned heavily on that old perception, as if that perception has never moved forward. And the frustration that that video garnered within the knitting community isn't because knitters felt dragged backwards. It's that we don't feel given credit for having evolved forward.
Knitting has spread everywhere. In fact, you're probably wearing a knit fabric right now. T-shirts, sweaters, socks, underwear, basically anything made from a stretchy fabric is probably knitted. And making these fabrics is simple, at least in theory. All you do is create loops in a piece of string and pull one loop through the next.
And maybe the most important missed opportunity was this: the human element. Knitting isn't just a set of physical properties and clever stitch mechanics.
It's actually a little like programming, but with yarn. You have two kinds of inputs, and you can combine them in an endless number of ways to make fabrics that look and behave totally differently. Certain patterns of stitches naturally like to curve in specific ways.
It's the work of countless knitters who experimented, innovated, and passed on their expertise. The fact that knitted fabric behaves the way it does is inseparable from the people who figured it out, refined it, and turned it into a living craft. Leaving that out flattens knitting into a curiosity of physics.
But even though centuries of knitters figured out how to make all sorts of patterns through trial and error, how it all works was mostly a mystery.
When in reality, it's the story of human ingenuity. The difference now is that we're not moving away from domestic comfort. We're moving toward a broader spectrum. Cozy, yes. Absolutely. Always cozy, but also inventive, surprising, and alive with community. That's why the old snapshot feels so thin today. And that's the perception shift that many of us hope is finally on the horizon. Before anything else, I'm genuinely excited that knitting showed up on SciShow at all. A lot of us were excited to see it in that spotlight, which is why a lot of us were paying attention. But if I were sitting down to coffee with Hank, here's what I'd say. Hank, thank you so much for including knitting in one of your videos. However, I want to provide a little bit of perspective and context for you that might shed a little bit of light on why some of the knitters in the community bristled like they did. Knitting is inventive, surprising, and full of human creativity. The socks and sweaters you're wearing, they're not just loops of string obeying physics.
I mean, why do certain patterns of knits and purls create folds and zigzags or rolls? The answer, of course, lies in physics.
They exist because knitters, generation after generation, figured out how to manipulate yarn into fabric. Because people experimented with tension, designed patterns, noticed how stitches behaved, and passed those discoveries down.
I don't know. I can't believe this is just knitting. It looks like... there's a stitch in here, but there's not. So it's actually really hard to predict instinctively what a certain stitch pattern will end up looking like.
Every ridge, every curl, every little bit of fabric elasticity that you mention in your video, that's not just a force field, though I do appreciate the visual callback. That's human ingenuity etched into fabric. So when you talk about knitting, don't stop at the mechanics. Talk about the makers who made it possible. Because knitting isn't just a curiosity of physics. It's one of the oldest collaborations between human ingenuity and textile. It's domestic. It's practical, it's experimental, it's art, and it's science, and it's always evolving forward. So when you said that knitting might not fill people to the brim with excitement,
now perhaps knitting doesn't fill you to the brim with excitement.
The irony is, everything in your video and everything that could have potentially been in your video is exciting, not just because of the physics, but because of the knitting itself. The fabrics you can create with knitting were exciting long before the physicists arrived. That excitement predates science's gaze.
All of these fabrics, with their ridges and zigzags and bubbles, were made of some combination of knit and purl stitches. Now, for centuries, knitting was more of an art than a science. Centuries of knitters figured out how to make all sorts of patterns through trial and error.
It is called the scientific method.
But then the physicists showed up.
And maybe that's the heart of why knitters bristled. Because when you said, then the physicists showed up, it landed as if the craft only became fascinating once science took notice. But knitters have always known otherwise.
Knitting evolved purely through intuition and trial and error, but those knit patterns that emerged from generations of knitters tipped off scientists that there might be something useful here.
If only you'd ask, I could have told you so.
And that's the story I'd love to see told. Not just that knitting and physics intersect, but that knitters and physicists, the people, can collaborate, bringing their curiosity, their skill, their ways of knowing to create something neither could alone. So that's what I'd say if I were having coffee with Hank. But in the end, this isn't just about one SciShow video. It's about how knitting has long been flattened into a single image. Cozy, domestic, familiar. While the reality has always been so much more than that. Knitting has carried families through winters, clothed soldiers through wars, inspired designers to bend fabric into new architectures, and today continues to spark the imaginations of creators and thinkers and knitters all across the world. It's a craft that predates industry and predates science as we know it, yet it continues to evolve in ways that surprise even those of us who live within it. That's what makes knitting worth paying attention to. That's the kind of energy and enthusiasm and story that I love to be able to communicate to folks when I tell them, yeah, I host a knitting podcast for a living. And they tend to look at me as if I probably host a cozy little knitting corner. And they're not wrong. But I just want them to know so deeply that there's so much more to it than that. And that's why I'm able to produce video content week after week that, in my opinion, and hopefully in many of your opinions, is interesting and new and evolving. So yeah, knitting has always been way more than it's been perceived to be. And I think that's what people really want to communicate. That's what I want to communicate. And that's why when there's such a fantastic opportunity to communicate that story and help that perception evolve, and that opportunity's not taken, that's why it can be a little deflating. And I think that's what's going on here. But in the biggest picture of this particular video, and what I really wanted to do here was just talk a little bit about that evolving perception, because I think it's a really important discussion to have. And this video just inspired me to take that a little bit further and put it into action. I hope you took something from today's video. I hope you found this valuable. Please leave your thoughts down below in the comment section. Be kind, be respectful. Everybody has their own opinions and those are valid. But always know that when expressing your opinion, kindness should always come first so that the conversation can happen successfully afterwards. Happy knitting, everybody. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.